Good morning, everyone. Guys, the situation across the globe is absolutely critical. Everywhere right now, it seems like we're in the final countdown of whatever's happening. If you've been following this channel, guys, and please, if you've not followed or liked or subscribed, please hit the buttons below. We're on 3 platforms now, hoping to get 4 up and running pretty soon. So, guys, I'm going to focus this video on Ukraine and the imminent deployment of the North Korean troops. I'm going to tell you what I think they're going to be deployed for. But first, excuse me. But first, before we talk about that, I just want to give you guys a little snippet into what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. I'll just give you the headline. Middle East conflict. Beirut buildings destroyed after Israel warns civilians to evacuate. So can you remember on the 1st of, the 1st of this month, it seems like a lifetime ago, on the 1st of October, when the Israeli troops moved into Lebanon, can you remember that this was just going to be, a limited military incursion? It was just going to be limited military raids. And now there's explosions in Beirut. They're telling the civilians to evacuate that location. And very early on, I said, listen, if the Israelis, which I think they will, use the same tactics, which they have, in Lebanon as they did in Gaza, then you're going to see this. There really is no way back. Because the tactics that they used in Gaza, it's a new form of tactics. There's a lot of analysis being written on this. It's called like rubberized earth tactics or something, which basically means normally when you would be conducting operations in an urban environment, you would go house to house, door to door. You would have to hold a house, hold a building, hold a street. Everybody moves up to that line of advance, then you clear it, then you can move on. Now, the reason you have to do it that way is so people don't get in behind you, because if people get in behind you, they can attack logistics, they can be snipers in windows. It becomes very difficult to deal with people once they're in an urban environment, once they get behind your front lines. So what the Israelis are doing, they're just bringing the buildings down. They're moving through a building. They're just bringing these buildings down. If they bring the building down, they don't need to worry about bad guys getting behind them. They don't need to worry about anything really, because there's nothing behind them. Now, I genuinely don't think they can do this as there's a lot more buildings there's a lot more buildings in Lebanon than there is in the Gaza Strip. So it would be a lot harder for them to do this. But what it looks like is the Israelis really are. It's kind of not a limited military raid in Lebanon. It seems like it's, a full military, military assault. So yesterday I did a video about the situation in Ukraine, and we talked about these North Korean troops that were, imminently getting deployed into Ukraine. Let's just consider what's happened in Ukraine the last, the Ukrainians are struggling at the moment because this Western ammunition that keeps being pledged to them, and the Western munitions and, all this stuff that people pledge to them, it's not turning up on the front line. So what's happening on the Ukrainian side? The Ukrainians are planning these big attacks, and they're saying, right, guys, we're gonna plan these big attacks, and there are so many different aspects of this. It's really difficult to, in a short sentence, to be able to encapsulate everything. So I am generalizing, and there are more complexities to the situation than this, but for example, and I'm just totally making this up, but you'll understand where I'm going. So say, for example, the Germans have said, right, we're going to give you a load of artillery shells for a certain piece of equipment or whatever. The Ukrainians say, right, once we get those shells, we can do this attack. And then they tell the NATO general, or they tell whoever, and then they've told the NATO general, and then the NATO general said, right, good, that's great, okay. And then the NATO general comes back and he says, right, when are you doing this attack? And then the Ukrainians say, well, we can't because the Germans have not given us these shells. And then the NATO general will push him then, or whoever will put pressure and say, well, you've said you're going to do this attack. You need to do this attack. So then the Ukrainians will go into that, light or not as prepared as they could be. That's just the reality of, of warfare. These things happen. Also, one of the things that the Ukrainians are, I don't want to say it's the wrong thing to do. It's certainly not the right thing. It's not the wrong thing to do, but you need to understand if you do this on every circumstance, it's not going to end well for you. The Ukrainians are having this kind of tactic where they're not giving ground, where they're holding ground at all costs. Now, the problem there is you're holding ground at all costs. If you look historically, and this is not just Ukraine now, this goes back through most conflicts actually. I think you could probably go back to the Second World War, certainly Vietnam and the Korean Wars. But if your position is about to be overrun, you normally take most of your casualties the last couple of days before your position's overrun, because that's when the enemy's getting closer and closer and closer. And then when it gets too close, you can't withdraw. So you try a half-hearted withdrawal, and then it's in that half-hearted withdrawal you take more casualties. I think from day one, the Ukrainian, well, they started doing this, but I think from day one, the Ukrainians should have been fighting a more land mobile. And again, guys, I am very biased with this. All my military experience has been in highly mobile advanced infantry, air mobile infantry, fast moving infantry if it's on the ground, conducting raids, then moving out and not holding ground. Because when you start to hold ground, that's when you identify yourself for artillery, for indirect fire. So in the context of Ukraine, it's not the best. You see, it's difficult for me to say what's best and what's not, because there's not one answer. There's a lot of answers, and there's so many caveats that go with that. It's difficult to say. But what I will say is the Ukrainians need to be fighting more of a mobile land operation rather than a static operation. Now, I think a lot of that is down to inexperienced commanders on the ground, and I think a lot of that is because of the way that the Ukrainian military is trained. They're using a lot of conscripts. They don't have trust in their commanders on the ground, and everything needs to come from higher ups. Now, I could do it, guys. I would love to. I might do it on the whiteboard in the house. But if I did a side-by-side comparison on how British military works in comparison to how the Russian military works at section or platoon level, you'd understand how, speed is a massive factor in all warfare. And the Russian way of doing things, now there's reasons why they have to do that, and a lot of reasons are cultural as opposed to strategic or tactical. But one of the main problems with the Ukrainians is half of them are fighting with with NATO training, and the other half are fighting still with old Soviet tactics. Because a lot of the old, a lot of the generals, a lot of the people in charge, they are old Soviet colonels or Soviet generals, whatever you want to call them. So they don't know how to use a NATO force. They don't know how to use highly trained, highly motivated mobile infantry. Anyway, so North Koreans, what are they going to do when they get in the ground? Now, I think, and this is just my suspicion from looking and what I'm analysing, if it was me, I would say these guys would be used as drone operators or something to do with their drones, either producing drones, either operating drones on the front line. I don't think they're going to be as in bayoneting combat troops at this point. Now, the reason for this, it comes down to command and control. If you've ever had to work with a foreign military, and by foreign, I mean some Scottish units, you get this problem with as well. So if you've ever had to work with a foreign military who don't speak your language, command and control becomes ridiculously difficult. So if people, these North Koreans are not going to be used in conjunction with Russian units. It's just not going to happen. Now, the number of these guys, it's 10,000 to 12,000. We don't actually know the exact numbers, and the exact numbers that go on the ground could be inflated. We don't know. So they either need to keep them as a contained unit, whereby they have their own aspects, they have their own front line, they have their own lines of advance, or you need to bring them back and have them more in administrative support. I genuinely don't know what that's going to be, but I would say people from that part of the world are technically technically, what's the word I'm looking for? Technically literate when it comes to drones, when it comes to first-person viewing drones. Now, do the North Koreans have this capacity? I genuinely don't know. I would say that they do, but I've not seen anything that says they do. If they're kept as a unit, that's where they'd be more potent, because if they're kept as a unit or brigade level or battalion level, if they're kept at, you don't need as many interpreters, you don't need as many North Korean, Russian interpreters, because the problem lies when you get to a strategic level, a tactical level, and a Russian's trying to give an order to a North Korean. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to understand. They're going to go crazy. It's just going to be wild. So that's why you would predominantly keep them as a unit. So you just have one liaison set at the back of this, and right, okay, I don't know, North Korean Unit 1. You guys will hold this area, or you guys will advance up to this limit of exploitation. That one interpreter or liaison officer only needs to tell the commanding officer. That commanding officer can then brief his guys in his native language, and they can work on their own native language. It's really difficult, guys, trying to operate with other troops that don't speak your language. And that's one of the biggest problems that NATO have, the language barrier. And it's also one of the biggest not assets, but it's one of the gap. It's a good gambit that the Russians have, because the Russians, they have one leader, one language, one objective, one goal, and they can push towards it. Whereas NATO, on paper, side-by-side comparison, yes, they are better. But the problem is there's too many complexities in warfare now. There's asymmetric warfare, grey warfare, black warfare. There's unconventional, there's guerrilla warfare, there is cyber. There's also the sabotage, there's homegrown attacks. There's all sorts of aspects to warfare now. So it's not as easy as, doing side-by-side comparisons. That's why I think I'm shying away from doing a side-by-side comparison to NATO, a Russian section platoon versus a NATO section or platoon, because, I don't think that situation's ever going to happen. It may, and if it does happen, you'll see that NATO troops win, but there are, excuse me, guys. But you'll see there's so many complexities in warfare now, and there's so many different dimensions. It's absolutely insane. Guys, if anybody thinks right now we're not heading to a global conflict of an industrial scale, I genuinely don't know where you are in the world or what you're thinking. The world right now is insane. I hope that when these North Koreans enter the war in Ukraine, I hope more people start to say, hey, guys, listen, you know what? We're actually in World War III. Because not only when these North Koreans enter the war in Ukraine, and not only that's going to be a huge push for the Russians, it's going to open a precedent. What precedence? Well, that's going to open the precedence for NATO to put boots on the ground, for NATO troops to be actively involved in the war in Ukraine. Guys, those of you who think, I heard a few comments saying, it's looking like there's going to be a ceasefire in Ukraine. Absolutely not, guys. This war it's not even remotely over yet, guys. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better. And the insertion of North Korean, every time I say that, it just seems absolutely wild. But the insertion of these North Korean troops into Ukraine, it's a massive, it's not even in the same context of an escalation. It's in the context of a totally new dimension, and if the Russians, like I keep saying, are going to do a multi-pronged attack, the Ukrainians have nothing left to plug that gap with. So what I'd say then, right now, what I'd say the Ukrainians need to do, the Ukrainians need to understand that if they get encircled, they are going to take huge casualties. So I wouldn't even bother. Right now, I'd be thinking about getting all my guys back behind the Dnipro, getting all my heavy logistics, heavy artillery, getting everything back behind the Dnipro, where we can form legitimate defensive lines, where we have natural features that we can use as defensive features. Because right now, at the moment, between the east of Ukraine and Kiev, there's pretty much nothing but flat open farming land. Anyway, guys, I'm going back to grid. I'll get you guys another video later.